Hello and welcome to ITGA's Collaborative Community Conversations Fall Webinar Series. We are so excited to have you with us today. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Beth Bagwell, and I am the Executive Director of ITGA. We wanted to let you know that December the 4th, we are having our next webinar series, Unsanctioned Large-Scale Events, Do's and Don'ts, Lessons Learned from the Field. We will put the link to registration in the Q&A. Questions are welcome throughout today's webinar. Please use the Q&A. The chat has been disabled. Today's webinar is recorded, and the link to the video and the PowerPoint will be sent to you in today's email after our discussion. And before we start, we're going to show you a quick video.
The International Town Gown Association wants to help your campus and community achieve their goals and grow your professional network.
Benefit of being a member is the community of practice that surrounds you. It's the support of like-minded individuals that are very often feeling that they're working in a siloed position within their institution, that it's difficult to reach out to other colleagues for support, and that's where the ITGA steps in.
The power of universities and communities working together, really, I'm passionate about it, and I believe that it just benefits every community that has a higher education institution.
Always reaching out to other people and working with other people to make things better in our communities. And so I think with ITGA, I have the chance to meet people internationally who are doing innovative work, who maybe have dealt with the same thing in their own community. And it makes my path to working easier.
I was looking for that bridge, that connector, and I found ITGA and found out what they did and read up on them. And I said, this is the ideal organization to really bridge that gap so that we could strengthen our relationship and our connection between the two.
Coming here and meeting people who have tried new and different things and are willing to share their ups and downs helps me to be better professionally in my role at the University of Georgia.
What do universities bring? What do college towns bring? And how do we work together to address the concerns and find the opportunities? That's something that I think this organization does uniquely well.
These are my people, if you will. I don't have to explain anything. They get it. They know what the challenges are, and they know what the potential and opportunities are.
Join our vibrant network of college and university administrators, city leaders, public safety professionals, and campus neighbors to advance your campus and community. Contact ITGA about how to join today.
Okay, we are excited to kick off our today's presentation. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Sally Lanowski. She's the Assistant Dean of Students at UMass Amherst and also an ITGA board member. Please get us started, Sally.
Thank you, Beth. Just a little correction. I'm not an assistant dean of students. I am a lecturer in health promotion and policy in public health. So just so people know who I am currently. Drinking in college has long been a ritual that students and others see as an integral part of the higher education experience. A 2022 national survey on drug use and health revealed that 49% of our college students drank in the last month. 29% were binge drinking, putting themselves and others at harm. 14% of our college students meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder. And 1 in 5 college students experience sexual assault. Oftentimes, those are connected to alcohol abuse. In our town gown communities, partying behavior results in neighborhood tensions, late night noise, trash, property damage, and disruptions of quality of life for all residents, including students who may live off campus. However, there are effective strategies to reduce alcohol misuse and its related harms. And today you will learn about one that has great evidence of effectiveness for many, many years, as well as some new and emerging evidence about some modifications and innovations to this theory-driven work to improve our communities and reduce alcohol-related harms. At this point, I would like to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Bill DeYoung. I've been working on college alcohol prevention for 30 years now. and a whole variety of different projects. Very pleased to be working with ITGA. I have been reviewing the Great Place program going back to 2012, more recently through the contract that ITGA has with Molson Coors. Just say a little bit about the Great Plays program. One of the things that's critical here is that once the company signs a sports marketing contract with the athletics department at a university, that university is then eligible for a grant to support its prevention work. Each year that the contract is in place, universities are eligible. The grants currently are now up to $15,000 a year. And of course, I'm referring to myself in the third person here because you'll get the slides later. But yes, I try to make this application process as easy as possible, meaning that have a session with people to talk about their ideas, come up with a sense of what they might want to propose. I review early drafts. So by the time it's submitted, check the box and the money comes to the university. You can see the different areas that can be the point of focus. One of the things that's very important here is that the application generally should emphasize evidence-based programs, and I refer you to the College AIM website to get an update on what is considered evidence-based presently. We're certainly open to new innovative approaches, but in order for us to consider that, there has to be some number of evidence-based programs already in place so that that foundation is there. One of the things to emphasize with the application is that there should be an evaluation plan. Collaborating with other parts of the university, with members of the community are certainly a big plus. So I mentioned before, the grants are for up to $15,000 a year. Indirect costs cannot exceed 12% of the total budget. We do encourage applicants to look into the possibility that their grants and contracts office will waive that indirect cost. And sometimes that happens, sometimes it's reduced. So once a university is affiliated through the marketing agreement, can apply annually for continuation funding or even submit new ideas. And there you'll see the contact information. Susan Stafford oversees the program. And if you're interested in seeing what the application looks like, you'll see the URL there. So one of the things that I've been very pleased about, having reviewed the programs over the years, is that more and more universities are really moving toward evidence-based programs. And one of those, of course, is what we call the social norms approach. And we have with Stacey Hust and Jessica Willoughby a terrific example of a social norms campaign with solid research. So I'll turn it over to them now.
Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate it. So thank you, Sally, also for kind of setting the stage and talking about this important topic. I'm sure it affects most of us at our universities, and we see it as an important pressing concern on college campuses nationwide. So Jessica and I have been doing research related to substance abuse prevention and sexual violence prevention for close to 2 decades at this point. I especially, I'm the older of the two. I've been doing this for a very long time. I actually received a Great Place grant back in 2012 when it was first initiated. And I believe I've received consistent funding since then. Either I or somebody at WSU has. We are today going to be talking about a lot of research and a lot of findings that have been supported by this mechanism. And to that, we're truly grateful. I'm a professor and associate dean of faculty affairs and college operations in the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication. I'm a co-director of the Media, Adolescent, and Cannabis Lab, along with Jessica Willoughby. That group, it's called Cannabis because of the bulk of our research the bulk of the funding that comes through it is through cannabis money. But that's also where we do our substance abuse and our alcohol abuse and sexual violence reduction work. I've designed and evaluated more than 24 health communication campaigns over the past 2 decades. Almost all of these have had a component related to substance abuse reduction, although some have focused solely on sexual violence and sexual assault reduction. My research focus is on substance misuse and prevention and sexual violence reduction among adolescents and young adults. Jessica?
Thanks, Stacey. I'm Jessica Willoughby. I'm an associate professor and the Lester M. Smith Distinguished Professor in the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication. As Stacey mentioned, I also co-direct the Media, Adolescent, and Cannabis Research Group. And I've designed and evaluated multiple technology-based health interventions over the past decade, probably about a dozen now. And a lot of those have been things like text message-based or social media interventions, because a lot of individuals, especially young adults whom my work reaches out to, are using these spaces for information, including health information. So my focus overall is on using technology for health risk reduction among adolescents and young adults. We did briefly want to mention the amazing research group that helps us run all these projects. As we noted, the Media, Adolescence, and Cannabis Lab is where we do a lot of our work related to substance use more generally. We've been fortunate in that group to be funded through the dedicated marijuana accounts grants, which come from funding through Washington State University that comes from the Washington State Legislature, through the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and the Great Plains Grant, which is funded by Molson Coors and managed by the International Town and Gown Association. We're also a mixed methods research group focusing on both qualitative and quantitative methods. We really come at this from a perspective of, we have a research question, what is the best method to address that question? So we use methods including in-depth interviews and focus groups, as well as surveys and experiments. Research mentoring is also a large component of the work that we do, because we know that these issues and problems that face everyone in higher education and related to substance misuse continue, and it helps to have others in the field who are also continuing to work on these areas as well. So we're fortunate between Stacey and I to also have doctoral candidates working with us, 5 doctoral students and master's students as well, who bring a lot to the table and participate in these projects, and we're really grateful for their help and assistance. So today we're really going to focus on 3 main areas. We're going to talk about substance use in the media, specifically entertainment, social media, and advertising effects. We'll then move into designing effective prevention messages, talking about the social norms approach. And we'll finish it off with lessons and challenges to the social norms approach based on some things that we've experienced and you might have seen in your own work as well. As was previously mentioned, please feel free to pose questions if you have them, and we will address them throughout the presentation. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Stacey to start us off with some effects.
Thanks, Jessica. So I always think it's important when we're talking about using the media to help reduce or prevent behaviors that we understand all the other types of media that college students and young adults are seeing, because you have to know where your message is going to land, what it's going to compete against. So what's really important to understand in regards to substance use in entertainment media is it's incredibly popular and very common. Alcohol is the most common beverage depicted in media. More common than soda, more common than milk. Alcohol is really it. And that's true in programs that are targeted to very young individuals. TV programs, for example, popular among boys 11 to 16 years old, included 21 alcohol-related incidences per hour. What this means then is that our target audience is seeing an awful lot of content that promotes alcohol consumption. And it's rare for that content to talk about moderation or drinking responsibly. Instead, it is more common for that content to show individuals overusing or becoming intoxicated or drunk related to alcohol. In addition, the media also connects alcohol to sexual activity. And this happens more often and more commonly than what we would like to think. So a study in 2005 found that about 16% of television portrayals linked alcohol with sex. But more recent research indicates that it's more common, in part related to the type of television that you're watching. For example, reality dating television programs, which are really popular among college students, on average, they depict alcohol and sex together in 6 scenes per hour. So 6 times per hour that people are watching that program, they are seeing alcohol connected to sex. Now, why do we care about that? Why is that important? Well, it's important because if we see this content and we see that alcohol and sex and connecting them are normalized, or we see that getting drunk is normalized, then we may perceive that people in our sphere are doing that as well. And in fact, we may perceive that everyone is doing that. And that's a change in our norms, our normative beliefs, right? So as we look at substance use in social media, we also have to think about not just entertainment media, but how are brands leveraging social media? For those of you who've been doing this a long time, it is a wild, wild west out there right now, right? So historically, alcohol advertising and brand generated advertising, so something that was produced by Budweiser, for example, or in the slides that I have shown up right now, Absolute Vodka, those advertisements were regulated by the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States or the Beer Institute. And the way that alcohol advertising is regulated is there is a set of guidelines. If a member of the general public perceives that an alcohol ad violates those guidelines, then that member can raise that issue with Discus or with the Beer Institute. And that organization can instill what's called a post-publication sanction. What that means is if I think the ad and somehow violates the code, like for example, maybe it links alcohol to sex, then I write in, I say, I think this is a violation. And if they determine it is, they'll pull the ad. Not until people have seen it, right? Because it's post-publication. But those guidelines only are for brand generated content. What's happening now is user generated content because brands are leveraging influencers to produce content, not even on their behalf, just as a means of the influencer getting more popular. So what we've shown on this slide are a mix of brand generated and user generated content. So here on the left-hand side, the image of the woman reclining next to the pool and the image of the male and female who look to maybe be at a dance or at least in a club. Those are brand generated social media posts on Instagram. It's clear that both of those are connecting alcohol either to sexual activity or romantic activity or to sexual bodies. The 2 images that are at the top that are both of young women, those are influencer posts. And in both of those posts, the influencer is talking about using alcohol. All of the comments are related to the alcohol product that is in the user's hand. And then you'll see another brand generated post here at the bottom of the screen where it says Absolute Bloody Mary. Absolute Bloody Mary. I like to include this image because we don't often see that and immediately think of sexual objectification. But in fact, in this particular ad, they are truly making the female model the drink. She is the Mary that they're referring to. So even when a woman is fully clothed, sometimes the ad or the Instagram post rather is objectifying the woman in some way. This all has implications because of what we know from social cognitive theory. So social cognitive theory is a media effects theory that was developed by Bandura a number of years ago. And it tells us that we don't have to learn directly. We can actually learn from the media. All of us know this, right? If any of us have ever made a French crepe without going to France, we've probably learned it by watching a cooking show or a Pinterest video or even a TikTok, right? So we know we don't have to actually go and experience something to learn. That's true when we watch the media as well. In fact, we're learning lots of things when we attend to media. But social cognitive theory can also be used not just to explain media effects, but to help us to design better messages. And this is something that Jessica and I have done for a long time. When you're designing a message in order for it to be effective and you're using social cognitive theory as your foundation, you're wanting to pay attention to some particular aspects of the message. For example, you're going to use characters and settings that are realistic and of interest to the participant. Right? So for us, we use college settings. It might even mean that we reference a particular bar or a location on campus that make sense to the individuals we're trying to reach. You're going to mention the prevention message multiple times so that the viewer retains the message, right? You're going to show or model the character or the individual in the message adopting the behavior you want to have adopted so that the viewer can understand how to produce that message. And then you're going to reward that character so the individual feels that they similarly want to be rewarded. So in a concretely, if we want to think about this in relation to binge drinking, we would make sure that the message is in a narrative setting that is relevant to the target audience. We would mention multiple times that binge drinking can be harmful. We would then show a person who maybe begins to overconsume, but then stops themselves and decides not to binge drink, and that person would be rewarded for making that decision. We know from lots of research by people outside of our research team, as well as our own research, that using this message, or this theory to design messages is effective. Jessica?
Thanks, Stacy. So also from work that we've done and others have done, we know that viewing alcohol advertisements and substance messaging more generally can impact intentions and youth behaviors around using those substances. It also can have an impact on areas outside of just use. And we wanted to talk a little bit about some of those effects here. So I'm going to describe for you a brief project that was done previously. What you're seeing is an original ad. The Bacardi ad that's on the left is the original ad that was used as part of promotional materials for Bacardi. And then the ad that's on the right that shows the woman with a head is one that was modified in this case for us to look at differences in how objectified a person was in an advertisement and the effects of viewing that type of content in your alcohol advertising. So you'll see that a lot of the other materials remain the same in the advertisements, like the text, trying to find an image where she also was wearing, leopard print or some sort of animal print as part of that process. Still trying to find someone who was kind of similar in terms of body, but now she has a face. She's made to be more of a person versus a sexualized object in this case. And we were looking at whether or not viewing these more objectified images would have a difference versus viewing these more lowly objectified images. This work was grounded in social cognitive theory, and it's really because of this idea that people can pay attention to these messages and see things modeled. What we found here was that participants who viewed the alcohol ads of the objectified women, so the one that had no head in this case, they were less likely to intend to intervene in a sexual assault situation that included alcohol than participants who viewed the woman on the right side, who was not as heavily objectified in this case. What's also interesting about this work is that perceptions of the content matter. We did this study with college students, and we were also interested in how their opinions toward the ad might also impact their intentions or behaviors. And in this case, if they found the character in the ad to be appealing, that did increase their intention to intervene. So in this case, if they perceived that the woman was appealing, someone they would be interested in knowing, things like that, it actually led them to be more likely to say that they would intervene in a sexual assault situation that involved alcohol than the participants who viewed the objectified ad alone. We point this out because it also shows the impact that these messages can have beyond just the use of substances themselves, but in these other situations where substances can also be problematic, like in sexual assault situations. And we note these type of effects also occur in other programming types besides advertising, like popular television content. Television content in particular has the added, benefit in a lot of cases where they can model behaviors, right? Where you can actually see the behaviors come through. And if you're seeing characters who are rewarded for engaging in certain behaviors, according to social cognitive theory, you're more likely to then want to engage in those behaviors yourself. We did want to tie this to also another model, one more theory, the integrated model of behavioral prediction, and point out that we also use this theory to inform a lot of our work. This theory tells us particularly that attitudes, norms, and self-efficacy, or your confidence in your ability to do something, influence our intention, and that then influences our behavior. What's really neat about this model is it also tries to highlight a role that media can play here, and it starts with media on that very left-hand side as part of those distal variables. So what we're really talking about here is this idea that demographic variables, culture, attitudes, but also media exposure and media use have an impact downstream on our attitudes about topics, our norms and beliefs about those topics, and our confidence in our ability to be able to do something when situations arise. And those then lead to our behaviors down the line. It's important to highlight here that the norms also play a large role, so those attitudes, norms, and efficacy, and that's going to lead us to our discussion in designing some effective messaging that relates to norms as well.
Yeah, so we've actually done a lot of social norms work, and I'll self-disclose at the beginning of my social norms journey, I really was not a believer. I was very skeptical that using a norm and telling people about a norm was going to have an effect. And the more that I did this work, the more I realized that it is actually a very useful tool. And norm correcting messaging can really help behavior change. So as we go forward to talk about what social norms is, I'll just talk about this briefly because I know many of you have used social norms. I want to first call attention to the poster here on the slide, which we will talk about in a minute. This is a poster that was actually published on Northwestern University. It was actually disclosed publicly because students at the university did not find that it was effective. And so it was included in a news story about how the university had invested money in this campaign that students did not appreciate. So social norms should emphasize positive behavior. That's really important. It's also important to understand the referent group. So in this particular poster, the referent group is first-year students. And I assume who they're trying to target is other first-year students. It's important to understand whether that is an appropriate referent group. For example, if you're working with sorority and fraternity members, our research indicates the appropriate referent group is other sorority and fraternity members. If you're trying to change their behaviors and you talk about the general population of college students, it does not work because they do not view themselves as the same as the general college student population. Similarly, if you're talking about certain topics, you may need to use gendered social norms so that you're comparing men's behavior to men and women's behavior to women. It's important that if you're using a data-driven social norms, that the message is simple. You can also use one of two types of norms, and there's a lot of variations on descriptive and injunctive, but to keep it simple, descriptive norms are the actual behavior you're trying to change. Injunctive norms are beliefs associated with that behavior. And what we have found that a lot of people sometimes forget is that it's important to consider the graphics because the visuals play an important role when people are making sense of messages. So if you look at this message in particular, it says 82% of first-year students plan to pace drinks to 1 hour. And then the individual who looks to be maybe like a businessman with a watch and kind of a suit jacket and a shirt underneath is holding a red Solo cup. There's a lot of bottles in the background, one of which is water, and there's one water bottle in the foreground. I would argue that in this message in particular, it's really unclear to understand just quickly what they mean by planning to pace drinks. Does that mean you're supposed to be consuming water while you're consuming alcohol? If so, one might argue that the person who's modeling the behavior should hold a water bottle instead of a red Solo cup, because typically college students aren't putting water in their red Solo cups, right? And then additionally, because it's unclear what that message is, there's a lot of alcohol in the background. There's multiple red Solo cups. There's a bottle of hard liquor. There looks to be a bottle of beer. And so a person who's reading this message really has to kind of wade in and cognitively process the message in order to understand what it means. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't effective. I actually don't know if it was effective or not, but it didn't resonate with the target audience because it's a fairly complicated message. And I would argue as a message design expert that it's too complicated of a message to use in this kind of form. Jessica is going to talk about another example of a social norms message.
Thanks, Stacey. This one was geared towards high school students, and a couple of things we wanted to point out here in particular were a few of the strengths. We can appreciate that it's not showing people in a group who are consuming alcohol in particular, because one thing that we often see that Stacey mentioned is needing to match our graphics to the information we want to present. So the text here says most ETHS students choose not to drink alcohol. So one of the strong points here is that they did choose to have an image that did not show people consuming alcohol, because sometimes in these situations, we'll see people showing a group at a party, for example, where they're holding the red Solo cup. And in that case, your graphic doesn't actually match up with your text, and that can be confusing for a person who's reading it. What behavior are you really modeling? So one of the strengths is that image selection, and leaving out alcohol in particular. This message also uses the source as a form of credibility here. So they are sharing with you where they collected their data and how many people were involved in that data collection effort. One of the things that we've seen from college students in particular is that they can question social norms campaigns, particularly where the data come from, how relevant the data are. So including some sort of citation or information on when those data were collected, or who those data came from, can be useful in helping dispel some of that and increase the credibility of your messaging. Some parts that maybe could have been strengthened. The text in particular mentions that most students choose not to drink alcohol. For a lot of us, most is a very vague number. We don't know exactly what most looks like. And while they do give us more details in the smaller text, that it's 72% in this instance, seeing that bigger text might be something that people are still unsure about. So what is it that they're doing also instead, right, of drinking alcohol? They're choosing not to drink alcohol. What are the other behaviors that could be engaged in here? Theory in particular would tell us that actually modeling those behaviors or describing those behaviors could be beneficial by letting people know what other behaviors they could engage in as opposed to drinking alcohol might also encourage people to engage in some of that as well. So additionally, I think it's interesting to think about the image selection here in terms of who they used. This is a message that was designed for high school students, and it would be important here to make sure that the image seems reflective of that. I'm not sure from this image that these look like high school students, but you could hopefully conduct some sort of formative research to get more feedback from your participants to see, do they actually think these look like high school students? Are they similar to the high school students that they see as part of that process and around them? And Stacy is going to talk us through social norms messaging specifics here.
Yeah, so when you're designing your social norms messaging, it's really important to follow a pretty straightforward process. So the first thing you have to do is field what we call a social norm survey. This is really important. And the way your questions are worded are important. The way you think about your questions are important, because when you field that survey, you're gathering data that's going to be used in your message design. The survey has to include, at minimum, 2 things. It has to include the personal behaviors, and it has to include the perceived collective norms. So here I've included 2 examples, one of each, that we've actually used in our data, and I've given you the results. So the personal behavior that we used was, as a result of drinking alcohol, I have had unprotected sex. The mean was a 3.37, standard deviation was a 2.51. We then asked, this was a survey of women, we then asked them if they perceived that college women have had unprotected sex. You can see that the mean is higher, 4.72, and the standard deviation is lower. Once you have those 2 pieces of information, you then want to determine 2 things. The first is whether or not pluralistic ignorance exists. Pluralistic ignorance is this idea that there is a gap between our personal behaviors and our perceived collective norms. So we either overestimate or underestimate our peers' behavior. If that gap doesn't exist, and believe me, I've had that happen before, then that means that the social norms is not going to work. You can't correct norm messages when there's no gap in place. I have seen this mostly with living groups. So for example, I've ran a social norm survey with sorority members, and they had pretty accurate estimates of how their peers acted and behaved. And so because there was no gap between their personal behaviors and their assumptions, then there was nothing for us to correct. We in our lab identify whether or not the norm and the personal behaviors and perceived collective norms have a gap by looking at either percent differences or t-test differences. And typically what I do and what I like, kind of like a rule of thumb, is I'd like for there to be at least a 25% gap. So if I'm looking at the percent of people who agree that as a result of drinking alcohol, they've had unprotected sex, and then if I'm looking at the percent who believe that their peers have done that, I want there to be at least a 25% gap. That gives us a lot of room then to correct norm behaviors and to create norm, to change norm perceptions. But the other thing you have to do, and this is not talked about a lot, and it's not often done in my experience, is you have to make sure that the personal behavior is actually going to be affected by the collective norm. Now, the reason why this part is missed often is because we regularly use social norms for behaviors that we know are affected by by perceived collective norms. So, for example, binge drinking, driving while intoxicated, using alcohol, and how often you're using it. Those are things that we know from the research and from existing literature are often affected by perceived collective norms. We're going to drink to match our peers, essentially. But when you start applying social norms to sexual violence reduction, it may not be the case that your personal behavior is affected by the norm. This happens, for example, in a lot of consent related items. So I've done a lot of research related to sexual consent. I've tried to use social norms. And the reality is, if you underestimate how often your peers ask for consent, it doesn't really change whether or not you intend to ask for consent. So consent tends to be a personal decision that's not driven by perceptions of peers' behavior, at least in the research that we've collected. Therefore, we wouldn't use social norms to correct or to change perceptions around consent because it doesn't matter. You could have people give better estimates of their peers' behavior, but it's not going to affect their own personal behavior. So if that's what you're wanting to change, the norm messaging will not work. So to do that, we test a correlation between that collective norm and personal behavior. We typically like to see a correlation of 0.2 or higher, and the higher correlation means the greater effect that the collective norm is going to have on the personal behavior. In this particular instance, the norm was the correlation between the personal behavior and the collective norm was 0.331. So we could use this norm in a campaign and have an effect on that personal behavior. Jessica, go ahead.
Thanks, Stacey. And if you're wondering what happens when you don't have all those criteria met, we'll talk about that a little bit later in this presentation. What we want to talk about now are some lessons and challenges to the social norms approach based on our experience. And to situate some of that, I do want to talk a bit about how we've used narrative messaging in our work, because that's going to come into play with how we also use it with social norms. So we've talked a tiny bit about narrative before, just talking about effects and alcohol advertising, as well as television shows and things like that. In general, narrative messaging is this idea that we can use storytelling to try to convey attitudes and behaviors related to health outcomes. And so here what you're seeing is an example of a narrative message. This is not the whole message. There's actually additional messaging here, but we wanted to keep the slide somewhat readable. We designed a set of narratives that had at least 6 messages to them and were designed to be used as a potential text message intervention. And this narrative was designed to talk about alcohol and sexual hookups, essentially. And what we were trying to do was create a narrative that would resonate with the target audience, that could be sent and would model positive behaviors, essentially. So what you're seeing here includes some other things that were not part of the actual intervention that we first developed, including the image, although images can certainly be added to enhance messaging when you're dealing with narrative. But we worked with 31 college students to conduct formative research and ask them about their perceptions about these topics first. And then using the feedback from them that we gathered in focus groups, we crafted a series of messages. Those messages were turned into a narrative, and then we also had a series of messages that were non-narrative, so they included the same information, but without the story format. And then we had a control condition that was completely separate and didn't have any topics related to this as part of that effort. And we ran an experiment where we brought people into the lab and had them view the messages on a mobile device and then respond to questionnaires. And we were trying to see if we had an impact specifically here on narrative engagement outcomes, because we wanted to see if narrative engagement could happen in these smaller text-based situations as well. It was not, a long narrative, right? When we think of stories, we often think of the novels we're reading or the television program that we watch for an hour. You don't have that much space, but you're still trying to see if you're having some of those outcomes here. So in that experiment, we tested for transportation, which is whether or not you're really absorbed in a message, as well as your attitudes towards some of those messages. And what we found was, in particular, the narrative messages scored highest on those outcomes. So people were still transported into these messages, even though they feel short and text-like. It means that people felt like they stopped paying attention to their surroundings. They felt engaged with the information that was present. They were paying attention to that message. And they also had higher attitudes toward those messages than the non-narrative version or the control messaging, meaning that they actually felt like they liked these messages. They felt like they were something they would pay attention to, which, as we know with college students in a very saturated media environment, is important. How can we get them to pay attention to our messages and the information that's out there? Stacey's going to talk now about how we can combine some of this with social norms.
Yeah, and Jessica, if you could just scroll back real quickly. So the behavior that we were wanting to affect with this narrative message were multiple, right? So we wanted to lower drinking, wanted to pace drinks, but we also wanted to normalize getting tested if you've had unprotected sex. And so you'll see that all of those behaviors are modeled in this relatively short message, right? The character is actually showing them, hey, I made this mistake and I still went out and got tested and everything was okay. And that is to help normalize that behavior so that hopefully if somebody's reading it, they will adopt that behavior themselves if they're in a similar situation. So what we've done as a team is we've created something called narrative-based social norms messaging. So because we know that these narrative messages work, we have combined them with social norms in order to produce a different kind of social norms than you see when you're just looking at the posters, like what we saw earlier. So I refer to those posters as data-based social norms messaging. So that doesn't mean that the narrative-based doesn't include data, but it also includes narrative content. So in data-based social norms messaging, you're highlighting the norm corrective message, you're including visuals, and you're referencing where and when the data was collected. In narrative-based social norms messaging, you embed the norm corrective content within a narrative. The narrative supports that norm by describing pro-social behavior consistent with the norm. You also include visuals, and you also reference when and where the data was collected. The reason why you need to reference where and when the data was collected is because it increases the message's credibility and it helps the viewer understand where the information is coming from, which is that key component of referent group for a social norms theory. So in the next example, you'll see an example of a narrative-based social norms message. This is actually a message that was produced on a Great Place grant. It was a ton of work. These projects are a lot of work because you can't just think of a testimonial or of a story just literally, out of thin air. You have to look and talk to your target audience. So this is a result of a number of focus groups, a number of in-depth interviews with fraternity members in which we talk to them about what happens when they drink alcohol and get into verbal and physical arguments. And we talk to them about when this occurs, how it occurs. We wanted to reduce this risk. We wanted, in fact, fraternity members to make decisions when they were intoxicated to not engage in physical altercations. So the norm here is 89% of WSU fraternity members have not gotten into a fight at a party as a result of drinking too much alcohol. That's our norm. But the content around the norm that is disseminated to fraternity members in something we call Zoo News, that's a play on Wazoo, which is something that our students call our university. The narrative is a story about a guy who's kind of gets involved in an altercation, somebody's talking to them, and he thinks he's gonna fight him, and he decides not to because he doesn't want to ruin the party. And his friends say, hey, good job, we're really glad you didn't ruin the party. Thanks for not having a fight with that guy. And once we talked to our fraternity members and we got ideas for the story, then we create this content and then we market test the content with other fraternity members to say, hey, is this realistic? Does this make sense? Does this persuade you at all? And based on that information, we refine the message or revise the message. And then finally, after all of that work, we then have a message that we can utilize in order to try to change perceptions related to this particular behavior. Jessica?
Yeah, so we wanted to pose a question to all of you now, and we're wondering which type of message do you think would be more effective at changing attitudes and behavior? We're curious about your thoughts on whether a data-based or narrative-based social norms message might be more effective. So if you could take a second and drop it either in the chat or the Q&A, whichever part you can comment in right now, we can go ahead and then see some comments that you might have for us. So what are your thoughts? Which type of message do you think would be more effective? That data-based or that narrative-based?
And we actually just had a question posed about that. So that's great, Jessica, that we're answering it.
Excellent.
A number of people are saying narrative thus far. Narrative. Many people are saying they think narrative is more effective.
Okay. Well, thank you to everyone for participating in that. So the answer is, like many public health related issues, it depends. We would say in general, narrative can be very effective, but also data-based can be effective. So we don't really have a clear-cut answer for you, and we would encourage people to also consider the situation that you're in and the types of messaging that you're using as part of this process, as well as the resources you have available to you. So as Stacey mentioned, it's fairly intensive to collect that narrative-based content and develop it in a way that resonates with your target audience. So if you're working with a smaller budget and you don't have the resources to do some of that formative work, or perhaps a smaller staff, and you need to be thinking about other approaches, still recognize the benefits of the database and what that brings to the table as well as part of that process. Additionally, it depends a lot on the format you might be presenting your message in. And so we'll talk a bit about how you can potentially use narrative-based in these other smaller formats. But on the initial thoughts of it, when you're thinking about a poster and you have just a visual and an image, sometimes narrative-based can be a challenge. We've been working on ways that we could still incorporate narrative-based into that type of format. But in general, data-based can also be highly effective there because you've got the data really clearly presented and in a way that people can see it. And you're not also including that other content that they might not pay attention to or they might not focus on. Similarly, you need to think of that presentation if you're going online, right? On social media, people usually spend less than a second on every message that they see. It is very fast that they are scrolling through content. And so if you've got message that you don't think is going to capture their attention and get them to pay attention to it, but you still want them to see that fact or that information quickly, data might be the way to go there as well. So unfortunately, we don't have a clear-cut answer for you, but we think they both can be beneficial in different situations. Okay. And then we wanted to talk a bit about challenges to social norms messaging and specifically how you can make messages that are relevant to your target audience. So as we've mentioned a few times now, that relevance piece is really important here. And a lot of it does come from this need to gather feedback from the target audience that you're working with. There's a number of ways that you can do that, but we've often found that qualitative methods can be really beneficial. So we often use either in-depth interviews or focus groups to first gather information from our target audience about how they're talking about these topics and where they're dealing with these situations, and really hear in their own words what those situations look like from them, right? What does it look like to be at a party and having people offering you alcohol and you want to turn it down? Because we need to have a narrative that goes along with those norms we might be interested in talking about, for example. So starting with that process can be really helpful. And then you can move into creating some messages that you further get feedback on, known as pre-testing, right? We want to test those messages with that audience and see if they're finding relevance and information that's relevant to them. So I wanted to show this example here. It's another example from one of the Zoo News state pieces. And this was a newsletter that were essentially distributed to undergraduate students at Washington State University. And this message in particular shows an image where there's a number of people together in a small space. And this piece talked more and had more information in it, but we really wanted to call out this picture in particular, because at first, the original image that we tried to use had a lot fewer students and a lot more space to it, because this feels kind of crowded, right? If you're looking at this image, it feels crowded. It's a lot of people in a very small space. However, what happened was in the pre-testing of that message, fraternity members that the message was piloted with specifically expressed that the houses that they were in were not as big and spacious as the original image that we had selected, and that there were always more people there. They were always a crowded space. So really, it was important in this case to talk to the target audience because it helped us pick an image specifically that felt more relevant to their lives, that they could see as a space that was similar to where they were engaging in these behaviors, that was similar to having people that engage in those behaviors with them. And this is just an example of how it's really important to make sure that your messages resonate in that way. Stacey?
Yeah, so we had somebody in the chat ask if a narrative-based messaging can still be used when social norms cannot. So for example, if there was a social norm that didn't correlate or that when pluralistic ignorance did not exist. And the answer is absolutely. And in fact, it's a really nice trick if you're still trying to use a prevention message and your social norms doesn't work. Rather than scratch everything, you could turn the norm into a narrative-based message. and not have to worry about those other aspects of norm corrective messaging. So it can work, and we have had to do that in the past, and can be really effective. One of the things that we've experienced as a particular challenge here recently is when we do work around alcohol-related sexual risk-taking and alcohol-facilitated sexual assault, there are very gendered messages related to this topic. So the way that men and women, for example, interact with this messaging and the way in which they perceive their peers' behavior are pretty distinct. So for a number of years, I've ran norms campaigns that are segmented and segregated based on gender. That became increasingly problematic as gender perceptions of gender became more diverse. So as we know, most of you probably know, both Gen Z and Gen Alpha identify primarily that there are more than two genders. Gender is no longer considered binary. And even if an individual from that target audience doesn't identify as non-binary, many of them believe that content should be relevant to everyone. These are generations that believe in inclusivity. And so if you create a message that is gendered, you run the risk of offending or off-putting a member of your target audience because they perceive that some group has been excluded. And of course, you also run the risk of excluding an important group. So what's difficult though is it's really hard to then tailor messages to meet every particular gender identity. And so one of the things that Jessica and I attempted to do was to see if we could create an effective gender non-specific message. So we created a gender non-specific narrative-based social norms message. We used a number of things to try to cue that this was gender non-specific. We included an avatar because we wanted to push ourselves to include a visual. So we used an avatar that was neither clearly one gender or the other. We used a name, Taylor, that could go for any name that could be identified with any gender. And then we also created norms that used they, them, so pronoun and stories that included they, them. And so what you see here is these norms that we've included are targeted to men, but we also had norms that were gender non-specific. So they would say instead, when asked, most WSU students said they don't have unprotected sex even after drinking, rather than having to be tailored. We ran an experiment in which we took gender-specific norms and gender non-specific norms, and participants were either in a gender-consistent condition or a gender inconsistent condition. So if you were male, you were in a gender consistent condition, you received the male norms. If you were female or identified as female, you would receive the norms for females. And then there were a gender non-consistent condition in which you could identify as a male, but you would perceive or you would receive messages that were gender non-specific. Does that make sense to everybody? Is that clear? Okay, so then what we found was that really you can do this. Our initial results indicate that this was successful. So individuals who perceived the message, Jessica, I think this is the next slide. Individuals who perceived the message was effective at reducing unprotected sexual activity were significantly more likely to report lower unprotected sex intentions. Those who identified with that character were also significantly more likely to report lower intentions. And whether or not they received a message consistent with their gender or whether or not they were inconsistent with their gender didn't matter. So this gives at least promising indications that we could use a gender non-specific message as a viable alternative to a gender-specific message. It has implications both for resources, of course, and for inclusivity. I will give a caveat to these results, however, because we did find that a portion of our participants assigned or ascribed gender based on the actions that took place within the narrative. So even in the condition where we used where Taylor was used, where we had the same character that was not clearly male or female, and we used they pronouns, because the character got tested for an STI, some of our participants said, men are not going to get tested. This is clearly not a guy. And so they perceived that this was a woman simply because the character got tested. So our next steps, we have some graduate students that are interested in pursuing this work. Our next steps are to try to see if we can create content in the narrative that is truly 100% gender non-specific. And that might be pretty challenging, but that's our goal, to see if we can make this work. And then finally, we mentioned that social norms can sometimes go awry. And so we'll wrap up here relatively quickly so that we have a little bit more time for questions. Feel free, by the way, to post your questions in the chat and we'll get to them. When social norms doesn't work, you kind of have to figure out why. So if the referent group isn't working, or if it's the behaviors are not correlated, you kind of have to pivot, and it's important to kind of ask what's going on. So Jessica will talk about what we did in our most recent survey when we found out that they were not working. You can
Thanks,
go ahead.
Stacey, and I will keep it brief. Yes, so as we said, we conducted a social norm survey of college men and women, and we used norms items that we'd previously used successfully. However, our results indicated that pluralistic ignorance did not exist in the case that we were working with, and the personal behaviors in particular were not impacted by perceived collective norms. So we did not have correlations, right, between the behaviors and the norms. Those things tell us that it's not really worthwhile to invest our time and resources into creating that intervention because it may not be effective for what we're trying to accomplish. So what this led us to do was really try to figure out what happened. Why was this going on? Because we've used these items previously and some things had worked. And what we ended up determining was that potentially our messaging and our questions in particular were not resonating with the target audience, with the ways they were engaging in behaviors currently, right? We had used these items previously a number of years ago. We felt that the items were still similar, but maybe they were not acting in ways that were in accordance with what we were gathering data on. So specifically, we had talked to some things. We went ahead and we, after conducting all of those pieces of data where we got the survey and we found the problems, we went ahead and did cognitive interviews, which is where you sit down with people, you have them take your questionnaire, and you ask them questions along the way. What did you think about while you were answering that question? What came to mind? What's a relevant example here? And what we found was that people had different interpretations of those questions based on some things that were happening currently. So existing physical risks, for example, speeding, binge drinking, things like that, these were still things that they associated with alcohol use, and those items still resonated. So physical risks are still occurring. However, some questions that related to things like specific acts like vandalism or specific engagement in risky behaviors, like examples with car surfing, were not relevant to everybody, but maybe specific to men. These very physical risks were something they thought that men might engage in, but the question didn't feel relevant to them, which made it difficult for them to answer. Similarly, they felt that vandalism was low overall on campus, and because of that, questions related to that didn't feel as relevant to them as well. So they felt like the questions were really geared toward fraternities and didn't reflect everyone. So in our specific example here, we wanted to broaden the scope and clarify on-campus or off-campus behaviors because we think that's important to the work that's being done. And so we'll just skip ahead to some recommendations and key takeaways. Stacey?
Yeah, so in summary, we found that social norms can be effective. Narrative-based social norms can be especially effective depending on if your circumstances are right. We have some initial data to suggest that gender non-specific messaging will also work. Some topics can be more challenging, and we encourage all of us to consider that the message has to be credible, the visuals do matter, your norms must be current, and of course you want to consider your time and budgetary resources when you go forward to design the messages. We want to thank you all for being here today. If you've got questions, please feel free to follow up with Jessica or I. We've included in the slides our link to our Mac Lab, as well as a link to an online health promotion program we have here in Murrow, where people can get certificates around this kind of messaging.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists and the audience for attending today. We have recorded this webinar, and the PowerPoint will be shared with you via email so that you can go back and refer to some of the notes and the robust information that was shared today. So without further ado, we would like to say thank you. I don't know, Beth, if you have any parting comments. Okay. Thank you all.